Adolf Hitler was born in 1889 in a small border town of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. From the beginning, his life was shaped by instability, a strict, often intimidating father who wanted him to become a civil servant, and a mother he felt deeply attached to. As a boy, he was not yet a political figure. He was a restless student with shifting interests, drawn more to drawing, buildings, and grand scenes than to disciplined study. Over time, this mismatch between what he wanted and what was expected of him became a pattern. When reality didn't match his self-image, he tended to blame the world rather than revise his expectations. As a teenager, he dreamed of becoming an artist. After his father died, he attempted to pursue that dream more freely, and he moved to Vienna, a city that felt like a stage. Impressive architecture, museums, and crowds from many backgrounds. He applied to the Academy of Fine Arts and was rejected. This moment mattered not just because of the rejection itself, but because of how he interpreted it. Many people face failure and adapt. He increasingly treated failure as proof that he was being unfairly blocked. That emotional habit, turning disappointment into resentment, would later become a core fuel in his politics. In Vienna, his life became harder. He struggled with money, drifted through cheap rooms and shelters, and built a world view from scraps, newspaper headlines, street arguments, political posters, and the loud certainty of people who promised simple answers. Vienna at the time had intense political tensions and widespread prejudice. Hitler did not invent those attitudes, but he absorbed them and sharpened them. He began to see society as a contest between groups, and he learned that blaming minorities could create a feeling of unity among the angry and the anxious. This is one of the most important lessons of his early years. Extremist movements don't only rely on ideas, they rely on emotions like humiliation, envy, and fear, then offer a target to focus those feelings on. Another critical element of his Vienna period was his obsession with greatness. He admired spectacle, parades, monuments, strong symbols, and dramatic language. Even before he had real power, he was learning how power feels, how it looks and sounds. He was also learning how identity can be marketed. He began to think of politics not as careful problem solving, but as performance, a story with heroes and enemies, humiliation and revenge, decline and rebirth. That storytelling instinct would later become one of his most effective tools because people often respond more quickly to an emotionally satisfying story than to complicated facts. When World War I began in 1914, Hitler moved to Germany and enlisted. The war gave him structure and belonging. He served as a messenger, and he experienced the front as a place where fear, loyalty, and survival lived close together. For him, the war became a kind of personal meaning machine, something that made him feel part of a larger destiny. He was wounded and temporarily blinded during the conflict, and he spent time recovering in medical care. Later, he spoke about the war as a formative test, a place where he believed he proved himself. Then came Germany's defeat in 1918. Many soldiers felt shock and confusion. The country faced political turmoil, economic pain, and fierce arguments over who was responsible. Hitler responded in a way that reveals a deeper psychological pattern. He didn't just grieve the loss, he transformed it into a moral narrative of betrayal. Rather than accepting that the war's outcome had many causes, military, economic, political, he clung to conspiracy explanations that blamed internal enemies. These explanations were not merely wrong, they were useful to him. They allowed him to direct anger outward, to avoid ambiguity, and to claim that Germany's true greatness had been stolen rather than lost. After the war, Hitler remained in Munich, where radical politics were spreading. He was employed in a role that involved observing political groups, and it placed him in rooms where passionate speakers competed for attention. He discovered something about himself. When he spoke, he could hold a crowd. His voice, his rhythm, his certainty, these became weapons of influence. He learned to simplify complex problems into vivid slogans, and he learned that repeating a message with confidence can make it feel true to listeners who are exhausted and afraid. Around this time, he encountered the small German Workers' Party, a group that would later become the Nazi Party. Hitler joined and quickly rose because he did what many could not. He turned scattered frustrations into a single storyline. He spoke about national humiliation, economic suffering, and fear of social change, and he fused them into an emotional package. He also developed a habit that would define his future, portraying politics as an existential struggle where compromise was weakness and opponents were not simply wrong but dangerous. As he gained influence, he began to craft an identity, not merely a politician, but a savior figure. This wasn't accidental, it was carefully built through speeches, symbols, and the idea that only one strong leader could restore order. The value for understanding this stage is that the rise of authoritarian leaders often begins long before they have official power. It begins when they persuade people that normal politics is hopeless, that institutions are corrupt, and that only extreme measures can fix the country. This creates a psychological dependency. The audience stops judging claims by evidence and starts judging them by how strongly they soothe fear or satisfy anger. By the early 1920s, Germany's crises, hyperinflation, political violence, and social instability created an opening for radical voices. Hitler stepped into that opening with a talent for emotional theater and a growing willingness to use intimidation. The movement around him was not only a set of policies, it was a promise of belonging. Many followers felt seen in his rage, and he offered them simple targets, simple solutions, and a simple identity: us versus them. That is the first great warning sign in this story, because once politics becomes a battle of identities rather than ideas, cruelty can be reframed as necessary, and ordinary people can be nudged to accept things they would have rejected in calmer times. This is where part one ends, not with Hitler already ruling, but with Hitler becoming something more dangerous than a frustrated veteran. He was becoming a storyteller of grievance, a performer of certainty, and a man discovering that crowds can be guided not by truth, but by fear shaped into rage. In 1923, Germany's instability peaked again. Money lost value rapidly, political factions fought openly, and many people felt the country was slipping away. Hitler and his allies believed the moment was ripe for a dramatic takeover. In Munich, he attempted a coup, later known as the Beer Hall Putsch, hoping to trigger a chain reaction that would topple the government. He stormed a meeting, declared a national revolution, and tried to force officials to join him. But real power is not the same as a loud room. The state pushed back. The coup collapsed, and Hitler was arrested. This could have ended his career. Instead, it became a turning point. In court, he used the trial as a stage. He reframed himself not as a criminal, but as a patriot. The key insight here is how he handled consequences. He turned failure into publicity and punishment into branding. He was sentenced to prison, but the conditions were relatively mild. During imprisonment, he dictated Mein Kampf, outlining his ideology, his hatred, and his vision of a reshaped Germany. The book mattered less for its writing quality and more for what it revealed. He was not improvising. He was building a long plan grounded in extremist ideas, racial hierarchy, and the belief that democracy was something to be exploited, not respected. The most important lesson Hitler took from the failed coup was strategic. He concluded that seizing power by force was risky, but seizing power through legal mechanisms could be more effective. He began to aim for a path where elections, propaganda, and political deals would open the doors that violence could not. This shift, using lawful systems to destroy the spirit of law, is a classic authoritarian pattern. When he left prison, he rebuilt the Nazi Party with tighter discipline and stronger propaganda. He expanded paramilitary intimidation while presenting the movement publicly as a national revival. He cultivated donors, built youth organizations, and refined his speeches to speak to different audiences: angry workers, anxious middle classes, conservative elites, and disillusioned veterans. He promised dignity, order, and greatness, words that feel uplifting until you notice how they were tied to scapegoats and exclusion. By the late 1920s, Germany experienced a brief period of stability, and the Nazis struggled to gain mass support. Then the Great Depression hit. Unemployment soared. Despair spread. In crises, people often seek certainty, and Hitler offered certainty in a loud, simple form. He blamed enemies, mocked democracy as weak, and presented himself as the only figure who could unify the nation. In elections, the Nazi vote rose dramatically. He did not hypnotize an entire country overnight. He benefited from fear, polarization, and a collapsing economy. His movement thrived because it made people feel powerful again, while quietly teaching them to accept cruelty as a form of strength. In 1933, conservative leaders believed they could control Hitler by bringing him into government. They underestimated him. He was appointed chancellor, and almost immediately he moved to expand his power. A major fire at the Reichstag building was used to justify emergency measures. Rights were restricted, political opponents were arrested, and fear was amplified. Whether people supported him or simply stayed silent, the result was the same. The space for disagreement shrank quickly. Hitler pushed through the Enabling Act, which allowed his government to make laws without normal parliamentary oversight. This is a crucial step in the story. Dictatorships often begin with paperwork. Once legal barriers fall, intimidation becomes policy, and violence can be outsourced to institutions. He moved against rivals and even against former allies when they became inconvenient. He consolidated control over the police, the courts, and the media. Propaganda became constant. Posters, radio, rallies, and school programs that shaped how people saw reality. The Nazi state did not rely only on secret police. It relied on rewriting social norms so that discrimination felt normal and dissent felt dangerous. Persecution escalated. Jewish people and other targeted groups faced boycotts, exclusion from jobs, forced humiliations, and legal discrimination. This was not a single sudden event. It was an accelerating process. Step by step, the regime trained society to accept injustice, first as temporary measures, then as necessary protections, and finally as part of a new moral order where empathy was treated as weakness. Hitler also invested heavily in rearmament, violating international agreements. He framed this as restoring national pride, and many people, still haunted by defeat in World War I, found the message emotionally satisfying. Meanwhile, he tested the world's response with bold moves, remilitarizing the Rhineland, then annexing Austria, then demanding territory from Czechoslovakia. Each time he used a mix of threats and promises to push boundaries, while opponents hesitated. A hard truth emerges here. He advanced not only because he was aggressive, but because other leaders often hoped he would stop if given enough. Appeasement, confusion, and fear of another war helped him. His strategy depended on others delaying decisive resistance. In 1939, Hitler invaded Poland and World War II began in Europe. Early German victories made him appear unstoppable. But beneath military campaigns was a broader plan, a Europe reorganized under Nazi rule, built on racial ideology and ruthless exploitation. As the war expanded, persecution intensified into systematic mass murder, including the Holocaust. Even when described in non-graphic terms, the reality is overwhelming. Millions of Jewish people were killed, along with Roma, disabled people, political opponents, and others deemed undesirable. The regime used bureaucracy, rail systems, camps, forced labor, and propaganda to make cruelty efficient. One of the darkest insights in this history is that atrocity can be made administrative, carried out by forms, schedules, and obedient chains of command. Hitler's leadership style during the war grew more rigid and delusional. He increasingly trusted his instincts over evidence. He demanded loyalty, punished honesty, and made strategic decisions driven by ideology and pride. The invasion of the Soviet Union opened a vast, brutal front. Resources stretched thin, losses mounted, yet propaganda insisted on inevitable victory, trapping the public in a widening gap between official optimism and lived reality. Inside Germany, fear and control tightened. As bombing raids increased and shortages grew, the regime demanded more sacrifice while offering less truth. Hitler kept projecting certainty, but the state around him became more desperate. His power now depended on denial, denying setbacks, denying crimes, denying the humanity of those the regime targeted. By 1944-45, Germany was collapsing under military pressure from multiple directions. Some within the German leadership attempted to remove Hitler, recognizing the catastrophe. A major assassination attempt failed, and Hitler responded with harsh reprisals, further tightening his grip even as the war was clearly lost. As Allied forces closed in, Hitler retreated into a bunker in Berlin. His public image remained grand, but his real world shrank into maps, reports, and fantasies of last-minute reversals. He continued issuing orders that could not be carried out, clinging to the idea that willpower could override reality. This is a final psychological pattern. When authoritarian leaders fail, they often double down rather than adapt, because admitting error would destroy the myth that sustains them. In April 1945, with Berlin surrounded, Hitler married Eva Braun and then ended his life. The Nazi regime quickly collapsed after. Germany was left devastated, divided, and forced to confront the immense scale of destruction and crimes committed under his rule. The value of telling this story is not only historical, it is a warning about how hatred can be made respectable through slogans, how propaganda can replace reality, and how institutions can be bent until they serve cruelty. Hitler did not rise because he was inevitable. He rose because conditions, economic crisis, social fear, political fragmentation created openings, and because too many people underestimated how quickly a democracy can be hollowed out from within. And that may be the most important lesson embedded in the narrative. The most dangerous part of authoritarianism is not only the leader's ambition, but the gradual social agreement through fear, convenience, or silence that allows a country to trade truth for certainty and humanity for belonging.